It's a very thrilling day today. We're going to be fixing the notorious 1960 to 66 C10 hood rust. And maybe we'll toss in some tips on Mig Welding sheet metal because there's already not enough of that going around YouTube. Whenever I'm doing rust repair, whether I'm making pieces or welding in aftermarket patch panels or whatever it may be, I like to kind of just template the area before I cut anything out. Challenge is always just knowing what you're trying to achieve, because once we cut all this away, then it's hard to know what it's supposed to be. So in this case, I'm just going to template this profile here and just make sure this is all tangent here. If this had more shape to it, then I'd probably make some gauges for through here, just throughout the panel, and then I'd kind of draw a grid for each gauge. I could just make that out of cardboard or whatever and just give myself an idea of what it's supposed to be, because if I go to weld metal in here and it does something weird, then I won't know what I'm trying to get it back to. I also find on these old cars that the shapes are never exactly the same from side to side, or they're often not the same. So you always want to template both sides individually. You could be fixing a spot on the driver's side, and you could be trying to template it to what was off the passenger side. The passenger side could be a totally different profile, and then you're trying to getting frustrated trying to work towards something that the panel was never that shape to in the first place. So that's just something I found anyways. After I make my initial cuts here, I'm going to evaluate the inner surface, and we can see the inner surface has gone away. So we're going to have to fix that as well. I also take a look at the piece that I cut out, because I can't see in here because of the inner brace. I cut this piece out, and what I'm looking for is just any heavy pitting or pitting along here where the edges are. And if you can see that on the camera, we do have some heavy pitting right up to our cut line here, all through here. So even though the rust hole itself is only here, we're gonna have to extend our patch possibly another inch or so to get past this heavy pitting, because that's not only is that metal paper thin, so it's going to be extremely difficult to weld, but it's just going to keep rusting and rusting until that's a hole, and it probably won't be long before that is a hole, so we don't want to try welding to that. Always want to keep the patches as small as possible, but we also can't weld to garbage. So this is thinner than the metal on stuff from the 20s and 30s. If I see heavy pitting in it, then it means it's on its way out, so we might as well get rid of all that. Okay, well, we still haven't quite reached the extent of rust here, so we're going to put one more extension on Phil's trench here, and hopefully that'll take care of it. This is of course a scheduled monument, so we are limited to the amount of material that we can replace here. I don't know how you folks down in the south handle it, but it's 98 degrees out here today in Saskatchewan. That's just a bit too warm for me, but it's still only 75 here in the garage, so we're kind of just hanging out in here. And last video there was some major controversy on why I cut this hood up. So what happened to this hood is somebody pulled the old Jane Mansfield on it. Whole front is crushed, sides are crushed. So it is repairable. Anything made out of metal is repairable, but for me it was faster just to sacrifice this hood rather than spend the hours and hours fixing the entire top. You can see we've got damage all through here. So this entire area is affected. I don't even know what's going on here. This is all smashed. The front is really bad. This is just completely mangled and somebody tried to fix it already. And same over here. This whole side is crushed and smashed. Front is all bashed and just butchered, so I don't really see any benefit to repairing any of that. It'd take me a whole lot longer to fix this hood than what it's taken me to do the repairs that we're doing. So just thought I'd clear that up. Once again, feel free to skip past this part and ask me again in the comments why I didn't use this hood. Oh yeah, you can really see the damage there, eh? So I realize not everyone is going to have a donor hood to cut apart for patch panels. So, seeing as how this is probably one of the single most common areas on these trucks to rust out, I'll show you how you can build a patch panel for this outer portion here using very simple tools that hopefully, well, I would think anyone would have. So first and most important part is I made a template of this profile here, and we can see that fits like that, and it fits the same all throughout our patch area. And then as we work our way towards the front of the hood, it does change slightly, but for our intents and purposes it is all the same throughout here. If it changes, then what we would have to do is we would have to make a grid on here, like say every 2 inches or something, make a template every 2 inches of the shape, and then we would shape our panel to match the templates. Just to reiterate what I said earlier about stampings not being the same from side to side, here we have our same template that we just made, and if I go to this side, you can see right through here that there's a gap. This is in the same spot as I test fitted it on the other side, and we can see that this shape is not the same as the other side. So always make a template of each side. Don't just assume it's going to be the same from side to side. Now, most panels are also going to be bowed out and crowned. In this case, I put my straight edge on here, and I can see throughout this whole side here that we're completely flat. Only towards the front does it actually start to, this is really hard to film. There, can you see that? It does start to taper in at the front, but we're not concerned about that. We're only fixing this. Next thing I did is I just cut out a rectangular patch, cut it a bit oversized, and just ignore the holes here. This is just a piece of scrap metal for demonstration, but we'll just say these holes are for Bondo adhesion. I thought the auto body trade had kind of moved past the whole drilling holes for Bondo adhesion, like, oh, I don't know, some 30 odd years ago. But I look on YouTube and there's actually still people saying that that works. So just for the record, this is what happens when you drill holes for Bondo adhesion. All it does is just allow moisture to wick in from the back. The filler absorbs the moisture, rusts the metal out underneath, and then the Bondo falls off. You can see where there wasn't holes and it's just stuck to the metal. It's sticking just fine. I feel like I shouldn't have to say this, but this was never a good idea, and it was proved to be a bad idea fairly early on. But like I said, I guess there's still people saying that you should do this. So if there's somebody telling you to do this, they probably wouldn't take any auto body advice from them. But again, you probably shouldn't be taking any auto body advice from me either. So there you have it. Now I'm going to bend these edges. A lot of different ways we can do that. I'm going to use my bench vise here, but you can get creative. You can use some pliers like this and just clamp it on and fold it by hand. That works. You could clamp it in between two pieces of angle iron and just tap this over. Clamp it between two pieces of wood, do the same thing. Just hammer it over the edge of your workbench. Whatever you got to do to just bend these. There's no need for a brake or really any fancy tools here. Does help, but it's not going to stop us. I'm going to do a little bit at a time here. I'm using 18 gauge sheet metal. I build all my panels at 18 gauge. It is thicker than the factory sheet metal. Most sheet metal on old cars is going to be between 19 and 20 gauge, and as they get newer, the metal gets thinner. But I just prefer to go a size up, and then makes it harder to shape, but you've got more material there. It's better to have more material than not enough. 19 gauge is quite difficult to come by, at least here in Canada. So, and we're not doing any coach building or things of high caliber, so we just use 18 gauge most of the time. If I was working on something newer, then I'd probably just use 20 gauge, which is a lot easier to shape and still a little bit thicker, but I think 18 gauge on a newer car would be a bit overkill. Like by newer, I say like probably 70s or 80s or 90s, I guess, if you're into that. Let's help it along here. So there's our bends. So what I need to do now is, you can see, according to our template, I need to make this dish upwards. That means that we need to increase the surface area throughout here. By increasing surface area, I mean stretching, but we don't want to just stretch out like this. We only want to stretch in this direction, like so, which would be called a linear stretch. We're only stretching on one plane. And now they do make a hammer called a linear stretching hammer, and I'll put a picture somewhere in here of what it looks like. And I was going to build one for myself, but then I didn't. So I'm going to show you just a really crude way of how we can actually do this stretch with using what we have laying around. All we have here is a chisel hammer. That type of end on it. Is that going to focus? Probably not. Oh well. And a hardened steel surface like so. We'll hold it up against our hardened steel surface here. And we're literally just going to take our chisel hammer like so. This is really crude, but if we look, this probably isn't going to want to focus for us. Can you see that? This is starting to already dish in. You can see the gap here when we put our straight edge through here. So I am stretching the metal here. It has nowhere to go. It's being forced in between two hardened steel surfaces, so it doesn't have anywhere to go but out. That's fitting our template fairly good. You can see we've got our stretch in there now. Again, this is fairly crude, but what I would be doing if I was trying to do a better job is I would use something with a more rounded face to it, just so it's not putting these harsh lines in it. But if we look at it from the outside, like this would all planish out fairly well. But again, this is just using what we've got laying around. So now the problem is here, because we only manipulated our edge here, our profile starts to diminish as we go along the panel. So now I need to figure out a way to continue this indentation here. And if this was a crown panel, meaning the panel has shape in both directions, then I would have to approach this differently. What I would do is I would put that shape in the panel first, then I would tip these edges over, then stretch or shrink the edges to manipulate it. All I'm doing here is I'm putting a form in the metal, meaning I'm changing, the direction of the metal in only one plane, rather than creating a crown panel, which would be putting shape into it. So I already got lots of videos on the channel of doing that type of thing, so you can watch those. This is just a demonstration on building a hood corner patch, and maybe it'll help somebody, I don't know. Alright, we found a round thingy to try and put our bend in here, so not really anything too scientific here. We'll just kind of put some weight on it. Set this on here, and that fits all right for just a quick little demonstration there. We always want things to fit on as best they can. If you have to clamp it like forcefully or hold it in place forcefully, like you're trying to like force it to fit or whatever, then it means the panel isn't the right shape and it's not ready to weld in. Once it just lays on kind of relaxed, then you know that you're ready to weld in. If it's the wrong shape before you weld it in, welding it is only going to make it worse, because then what it'll do is it'll grab all the surrounding metal and it'll start pulling that into whatever wrong shaped panel that you're trying to put into it, and it'll just, then you'll think it warped from welding when in fact it was, the panel was wrong shaped to begin with, and it just causes all kinds of issues. Anyways, hopefully that gives some idea on how to make something like this. This is just garbage. I've got nice original patch panels in this hood that I can use, so I don't need that for anything, but hopefully that gives you some ideas on how you can shape stuff with just simple tools. I got lots of other videos on building crown panels and stuff using hand tools, so I didn't get into that. This is a rare case where it's literally only shaped on one plane, which is just basically putting form into it, not actual shape. So that was that. I don't know anymore. This is getting too preachy, so we'll just get back to doing welding and stuff and mindless entertainment. So what I do is I cut the edges of the patch so that they're butted up, and then the rest of this is just overlapped right now. And we'll just take an old screwdriver or a scribe if you're made of money. Oops. And we can cut to the scribe line, and in theory should just drop in like. I like to grind all the tacks down just to make sure that both sides of the metal are both flush, so there's not one side higher than the other. If one side is higher than the other, then I can go back now, cut it apart, realign the two pieces of metal so that they're flush, and then tack it back together. I usually only tack weld about every inch. This is a little closer here where I tack welded. I don't know why I did that, but it's not super important to get both sides of the metal totally flush without any edge on them, but it does look a lot cleaner when you're done welding, that you don't have a bunch of edges and dips and stuff, and it makes it easier to clean up the metal to prep it for filler afterwards if there's not any recesses or anything. You don't have to get it totally perfect, but just be aware when you do go to grind it, if one side's higher than the other, you got to stop when the grinder touches that first piece of metal. In this case, the grinder's touching both sides of the metal all the way through, so we know we're flush here. If there was areas where it wasn't touching, then that would indicate that it's misaligned. Talked about this a lot before. Another reason that I grind down these tack welds, and the most important reason before I finish weld, is when I go back and stitch weld this with what is hopefully going to be a full penetration weld, I want to make sure that I'm getting full penetration. So if I have a tack weld sticking up, it's going to create a cold spot on my new weld, and it's going to create an inconsistent area. We want consistency, and we don't want any cold spots on our welds because those can lead to pinholes or cracks or whatever. So that's the main reason I do this. And when I'm tack welding, I'm not doing a full penetration weld, I'm just doing a quick tack. That way, if there is an issue while I'm tack welding this, it's a lot easier to cut the tack apart, realign things, or fix whatever I gotta fix, rather than, you know, a really hot weld going in there. So that is the theory there. Now we'll start welding. So there's that repair. Not anything to write home about, but it's kind of solid now. And whatever, it'll body work out, and so I'm gonna call that good enough for what I'm trying to do with this. So some of you asked on the last video when I welded this front hood section in, why I was like just taking my time and just doing the 3 stitches at a time, letting it cool and then moving on, which is how I've always, you know, it's kind of the traditional, I guess, way of welding things and how I've done it years and years now, and always had success with it. Reason I did it that way is whenever I don't have good access to the backside to hammer and dolly welds, I prefer to just play it safe. You can never go wrong with, you know, playing it safe and taking your time welding stuff. So just as an experiment, I don't have good access on this side either, but I decided to just do the weld grind method just to see what would happen, and it turned out fine, I guess. I still did a little, I was able to get a spoon in and do a little hammer and dolly just to kind of manipulate it a bit. Just for the record though, I would highly recommend just doing the, you know, the more traditional method of just doing 3 stitches at a time, letting it completely cool, and then just moving it on and then grinding it after. Just because I always like to have that little insurance, because no matter what you do, whenever you weld, it's always going to shrink slightly. And a lot of times with MIG welding, you can just leave it and just go straight to bodywork if you have everything set up right, but there's always that chance that it could walk around on you. And so if I don't have access to hammer and dolly that, and I'm just going along as fast as I can, then I can potentially have issues that would be very hard to correct. In this case, we got away with it. Just as an experiment, I did this side with the more traditional method, 3 stitches at a time, let it completely cool, another 3 stitches, and just work my way completely across the patch. You can see we've got a little bit of misalignment here. I don't worry about stuff like that on a MIG weld. I would just, you know, body work right over this. Some people say just add more weld to that and just keep grinding and weld grind until it disappears. Well, every time you're welding and grinding, you're adding more heat to it, and grinding, you're removing more material. So is it really worth doing that to make this go away when you're just going to be doing body work over it anyways? No, I don't think so. Ideally, I always try to get things lined up as best I can, because it just, again, looks cleaner and whatever, but this small amount of misalignment here is nothing to worry about. What you don't want to do is just keep grinding until it's flush, because then you're thinning out this material here, which is higher, and there's no point in cutting out rust and welding in patches if you're going to be thinning out the metal afterwards, because the metal was already thin before you cut it out, and now you're just, you know, returning to what it was. So anyways, yeah, same different original kind of method over here compared to the other side. Not really any difference. I still had to do a little hammer and dolly manipulation just to kind of level it out a little better, but the difference between this weld and the side that I did the weld grind method on is there's not really any difference. So both methods worked out in this case, but again, if you're not sure, always go play it safe, take your time. That being said, with hammer and dolly and everything else, this patch only took me, between the welding, grinding, and hammering it, took me like maybe 15 minutes to do this whole patch. Whereas this side, I've probably got 45 minutes into it, so definitely the other method is faster, I guess, but faster isn't always better, but in this case, faster was the same. So that, I don't know what I'm rambling on. None of this is very helpful. This is just an awful video, so I'm sorry about that. Now, I did promise some welding tips in this video. What I'm going to do is, we got a whole pile of welding to do on this project, so I'm going to just spatter in some tips here and there. I don't like doing full-on how-to videos. There's already literally probably thousands of how to MIG weld sheet metal videos on YouTube. Some of them are excellent, some of them maybe not so much. It's up to the viewer to kind of decide what you're going to do, but we'll just go over a couple things in this video here. So everybody always wants to know how to set up a welder. So I'll just show you my process here. First things first, I think every welder has a little cheat sheet inside of it. Got this chart here, and so we can go through here, we can go down. I am welding steel using ER70S-6 wire, and I'm using gas. Always recommend gas for welding sheet metal, and you can either use 100% CO2, or what I use, which is what is recommended for auto body sheet metal, is a mix of argon and CO2, 75-25. Then we'll go to our wire thickness. For auto body sheet metal, you want to use 023 or 024 wire. That's what we're using here. I'm going to be welding 18 gauge. So I go here, it says to set it to 340. So we're at 3. And it says 40, which my experience is that this is not the going to be our best setting here, but it just kind of gives us a ballpark here to start out. Now we'll turn the welder on. This is a 2-stage valve, or I don't know what the technical term, I think that's the term for it, but it's been a long time since I learned this. So the thing with this, the valves on these, is they only seal properly if you open it all the way. So I want to open it all the way until it's all the way open. Otherwise it doesn't seal or do its thing properly. I don't know. But anyways, this is what I was taught to do. Always open these all the way. Then we set our cubic feet per hour. I don't know what that is in communist, but usually between 18 to 24 CFH. And if I'm doing just regular welding, I usually have it at around 18 or 20 or so. If I'm doing overhead, it takes more gas to push up above, so I set it at around 24, 25 or whatever. That's all been covered probably a million times. Now I'm going to test my welds. So what I've got here is 2 pieces of 18 gauge sheet metal, just little rectangles I cut out. And I'm going to test my welds on here. I'm going to use a process called stitch welding, which is essentially just a series of tack welds, but you're going for still a full penetration, so it's not really a tack, but that's just makes it easier to understand, I guess. So what I'm looking for on the backside is I want full penetration, and that is not full penetration. See, that's still cold. There's still a gap between our little molten blobs here, and it looks a little ropey on the top, so we're gonna have to crank up our heat on the welder a bit. So let's turn up our heat to 4 here, and our wire speed, and we'll just bump that up a little bit, and we'll see if that fixes anything. We're looking a little better on the back here. I can still see there's a bit of a gap here, but it's definitely got more penetration than this. But now what I can do is I can actually change my welding technique as well, and we'll see if we can get this to burn in a little better. So what I'm looking for is kind of something like this one here. Ouch, that's still hot. And all I really did is I just changed my technique here and just played around with it. And the way that I can change that is I can change how long I stay on the trigger, and I can also watch the puddle as I'm welding. Now if you use an auto darkening helmet, I don't recommend using anything other than an auto darkening helmet. It makes it so much easier to see, and you can see the red weld. and the longer you wait between doing your tacks, the colder the weld will be. So this one, I waited barely any time at all between each tack, so it was still very molten and very, very hot, and I could see that this technique gave me the best penetration. All the little dots on the back are all connected together, whereas all these other methods, I was waiting too long between each weld, so it was leaving it cold. So what I would do now is I would cut a few more of these pieces, and I would keep going over using that same technique that I used that got me the best results, and I would make sure that I can repeat that, make any adjustments on the welder as needed if I want to. Once I'm satisfied that I can get a decent weld and repeat it, then I will finally move on to welding my piece. The downside to these little 110 welders is they often don't have enough juice to just change your settings to weld on 18 gauge. So you got to change your technique, or another thing you can do is you can also leave a little gap. I prefer to weld with a tight gap, and so I just changed my technique. But if it makes you feel better, you can weld with a very, very slight gap just to help it penetrate in. I don't recommend a big gap or really any gap at all, so I just changed my technique. If you have a 220 welder, then you can crank up your settings a bit more and weld hotter. But that's just for these little welders. I find they don't weld 18 gauge as well. But most of you probably have one of these, so you can struggle like me. The reason I don't like leaving a gap when welding is, for one, I find it does cause more shrinkage and distortion. It just allows everything to suck in. A lot of people say one way or the other. I think it has a lot to do with your technique as well. The second reason I don't like leaving a gap, and the main reason, is I find that it's actually a much weaker weld. So here's our two pieces of metal. We're looking at them from the side, right? And we have our nice little gap here. And then I go to weld. I weld. And now what I've done is I've bridged across this gap, which is okay, I guess. But the problem is that a weld, or a MIG weld, is going to be much harder than the actual sheet metal itself. So now I have this very hard center, which is only actually connected to these two pieces of metal. It's only really burnt in just on the very edges. So what I found with this is when I go to grind it and try to hammer and dolly it or work it at all, it's always going to want to crack here because there's not really anything actually holding it. It's just this very hard blob bridging two pieces of metal, so it's not actually penetrated in. Whereas if I have a tight gap here and I have my welder set properly, my technique set properly, then when I go to weld it, it's going to actually, the molten weld is actually going to fuse these two pieces of metal together and intermingle with the actual filler material from the wire feed. And so this is going to be much stronger. Like I said, this is only if it's a full penetration weld. You want to make sure you're getting penetration, obviously, but if we do everything right, then this is going to be much stronger when we go to grind it, and if we have to work it at all. I really haven't had it. I've never had any issues with a full penetration MIG weld cracking on me when I hammer and dolly it or anything like that. Whereas this will definitely crack every time. So let's say that I wanted to weld this piece of metal into this hood here. Well, just testing on this piece of metal isn't going to give me the same results as if I was welding this piece of metal into this hood. So what you have to do is you have to replicate the exact, or as close as you can, scenario to what you're going to be welding on a car. That means take the piece that you cut out of the car, this hood piece, then take your patch, or a piece of your patch that you cut off, say from the same source, and then practice your welds on that. Then when you get a good weld on that, then you're ready to start on the car. The car is not for practicing or setting up your welder. The car is always going to be much harder to weld than your test pieces. Welding on a bench is way easier. Welding on a car, you're dealing with undercoating, rust, old paint, metal that's thicker or thinner in places. So you always want to try to set up your welder before experimenting on the car, and just recreate the scenario. So let's say I was welding on the top of this hood. Well, then when I was testing my welds, I would have this laid flat like this because I would be welding on the top, right? So, but if I'm welding on the side, then I would clamp it in front of me like this. If I'm welding overhead, then I'll try welding overhead. That's the trick to setting up your welder or welding on sheet metal, is just testing everything before you actually weld on the car. And I've done a lot of old Chevy trucks, so I have some idea now, but if I was to bring in a different Mig Welder, I would still test it before I started welding. Or if I was welding on something that I'm not familiar with, like let's say a modern car, I was welding for whatever ungodly reason I'd have to do that, I would definitely be testing my welds. And it's something that I would still do even to this day, is if I'm not sure, I'll test my welds on test piece of the exact metal that I'm going to be welding and the exact scenario that I'm going to be welding it. Then I'll know if I just go to the car and start practicing my welds, then I'm going to have bad, inconsistent welds. I'm going to have a lot more warpage. I'm going to have just blow throughs, and it's going to be a mess. So the other thing to remember as well is your welds on the car are never going to be as nice as on your test pieces, because as I said, the car is always going to have dirty metal or rust or undercoating. Or if you can't weld on the test piece, then you're not ready to weld on the car. It's only going to be harder and more difficult for you. I know everybody these days just wants to, turn the welder on and just instantly dive into their project and go to town on it. But you do have to actually, if you want to have success at least, you do have to go through the steps of getting to that success. You can't just expect to pick up the welder and just instantly be good at it. I'm still learning every day. I know having our cards and credentials on YouTube is apparently important to some people, so I am somewhere I've got a piece of paper that says I'm a interprovincial red seal journeyman auto motor vehicle body technician or some nonsense like that, which basically says that I went through a whole pile of training, and I'm now certified to fix vehicles up here in Canada, in any province of Canada. That doesn't mean I'm good at it. That just means that there's a piece of paper that's saying that I have the training. And then since then, I've been doing this for about 11 years now, mostly on restoration and hot rod type applications. I also have a few years of collision experience, but again, none of that means anything. You could be doing it your whole life and still doing it wrong, and I'm still learning every day. But just for the people who I guess having credentials and things is important to, I figured we'd just say that, even though I'm just a guy in my garage. Yeah, I don't know. That's my rant there. Again, I've lost track of where I'm going with any of this. Perfect. Oh yeah, when I was in school, I guess, I had to take these little rectangles like this, and I had to sit and weld these in a little welding cubicle for literally 1 month before I was allowed to weld on a car or touch anything. Just welding little pieces of metal together over and over and over again in different positions, like weld them like this or like flat or overhead. And then I had to do a welding test, and if I failed the welding test, then I got kicked out of class, which I didn't get kicked out of class, so that was good. But that's what I had to go through. And then even after that, it probably took me 2 or 3 years before I could confidently actually weld on a car, and I'm a slow learner, but that was just where I had to get to before I could finally just turn the welder on and start welding without running into problems or having to worry about things. And like I said, even to this day, if I'm trying to weld on something that I'm not familiar with, I will still test my welds. I'm not saying you have to spend a month welding little things together, but you know, it's not going to make you worse at welding. If you do want to do that, what I had to learn on is 22 gauge. I do all my fabrication with 18 gauge, but if you learn on 22 gauge, that's really thin metal. If you can weld on that, then welding on everything after that is much easier. So you want to pick up, plus it's cheaper, so if you want to pick up like a chunk of 22 gauge and cut it into little rectangles and just go to town welding it, you'll definitely be a lot better welder after you're done messing around with that. And I don't really recommend going to a junkyard and just getting a hood off a newer car. I mean, you could probably do that off an older car, like from the 60s or something, but if you do it on a newer car, they have a lot of different coatings on them. There's like an E-coat and different compositions of metal and stuff that make it really, really hard to weld, so you don't really want to make it any harder than you have to. So yeah, I recommend starting with just a fresh, clean set of metal if you're starting out, rather than trying to weld garbage together, even though you will be welding garbage together on your car. That's all for this video on welding. Hope some of you found that helpful, maybe, or most of you probably just skipped past this part, so thanks for, I don't know. That's all for this one. Next video, we're tearing this whole truck apart, breaking it down into a million pieces, and starting, well, then the video after that, I guess, we'll probably start on the structural repair of the cab, all the floors, rocker panels, lots of patch panels to weld in, so if you like welding, you'll want to stick around. That's what's happening. I hate to tear apart a running, driving truck, but there's no way to fix this properly without dismantling it, so that's what's happening there. Next video won't be out next week because I'm busy next week, so you'll have to wait a few days longer for it to come out, but that's what we're working on. One more thing, if you're watching this video on Saturday, tomorrow, which is Sunday, August the 6th of 2023, we're going to be doing a live stream at noon Central Standard Time, so 12 o'clock Central Standard Time. I don't know what that is in your part of the world, you'll have to Google it, but that's what's happening. We'll probably go on for about an hour or so, or until the what's your favorite food, what's your favorite color type questions start to pop up, and then we'll probably sign off. But if you have any questions other than that, or you just want to troll me or harass me or whatever, then you're all welcome to stop by and say hi. I realize the live streams aren't for everyone, but for those of you who want to chat, you're all welcome. So we'll give that a try, and I'll see you there possibly. If not, I'll see you on the next video.